Imagine you walk into your favorite coffee shop, same place you've been going to for years. You order your usual, a medium coffee, maybe a small pastry on the side. You hand over what you always pay, and the person behind the counter looks at you and says, "Sorry, that's not enough anymore." Nothing changed about the coffee. Same beans, same cup, same smile. But somehow, your money is worth less than it was before. That feeling, that quiet, uncomfortable feeling that your money doesn't stretch as far as it used to, that is inflation. And it is happening, right now, all around you, whether you notice it or not. But here's the thing most people don't realize. Inflation is not just a number on the news. It is a force that shapes entire economies, changes how governments behave, determines whether your savings grow or quietly disappear, and understanding it might be one of the most practically useful things you ever learn about money. So, let's talk about it. Let's actually understand what inflation is, where it comes from, and what it means for your life. Welcome to Michael's Mindcast. Let's get into it. Let's start simple. Inflation is the rate at which the general level of prices in an economy rises over time. When inflation is happening, each unit of currency, each pound, dollar, or euro buys you a little bit less than it did before. Notice the word general there. That is important. We're not talking about one product getting more expensive. We're talking about prices rising across the board: food, rent, transport, clothing, services. When most things cost more, that is inflation. Economists measure this using something called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Think of it like a shopping basket. Statisticians fill this basket with hundreds of common products and services: milk, electricity, a haircut, a bus ticket. Then they track how the total cost of that basket changes month after month. If the basket costs more this year than last year, prices have risen. That rise, expressed as a percentage, is the inflation rate. So when you hear that inflation is running at 4% per year, it means that the same basket of goods and services costs roughly 4% more than it did 12 months ago. Simple enough. But here's where it gets interesting. Why does this happen? What actually causes prices to rise? There are three main explanations economists use. Think of them as three different stories. All true, all happening at different times, and often at the same time. Picture a town with one bakery. Every morning the baker makes 100 loaves of bread. Every morning, 100 people come to buy one. The system is balanced. Price is stable. Now imagine that tomorrow 200 people show up, but the baker still only has 100 loaves. What happens? People start competing for the bread. They offer to pay more. The baker realizes they can charge more. The price goes up. This is demand pull inflation, when too much money is chasing too few goods. And this is where the idea of purchasing power becomes real. Your purchasing power is simply your ability to buy things with the money you have. When more people are competing for the same goods, prices rise, and each pound or dollar in your pocket buys a little less than it did before. Inflation, at its core, is a fall in purchasing power. This kind of inflation often happens during periods of strong economic growth. When people have jobs and confidence, they spend more. When the government pumps money into the economy, through lower taxes or more public spending, demand goes up. And if supply cannot match that demand fast enough, prices rise. But there's a second cause, and it has nothing to do with customers. Now imagine the same bakery, but the problem isn't too many people wanting bread. The problem is the ingredients. Flour gets more expensive, energy bills go up. The baker's delivery driver asks for higher wages. Suddenly, it costs the baker more to make each loaf, even though exactly the same number of people want bread. So the baker raises prices, not out of greed, but out of necessity. This is cost-push inflation, when the cost of producing things rises, and those higher costs get passed on to consumers. This is exactly what happened in many countries during 2021 and 2022. The global supply chain, the full network that takes a product from raw materials, through manufacturing, through transport, and finally onto a shop shelf, was severely disrupted after the pandemic. Shipping containers were in the wrong places, ports were backed up, energy prices spiked. When the supply chain breaks down, the cost of making and moving almost everything goes up, and businesses had no choice but to pass those costs on. And then there is a third cause, the most subtle, and in some ways the most powerful of all. Workers see prices going up, So they ask their employers for higher wages to maintain their standard of living. Employers agree, but now their wage costs are higher, so they raise their prices to cover it. Workers see prices going up again, so they ask for even higher wages, and the cycle continues. Economists call this the wage-price spiral. It is inflation that feeds itself. Once people expect prices to keep rising, they behave in ways that make prices keep rising. Expectations become a cause. This is why central banks are so focused on what people believe about inflation, not just what the numbers say today. If people trust that inflation will stay low, it is much easier to keep it low. If they stop trusting that, the spiral can take on a life of its own. All right, here's a question I want you to sit with for a moment. If inflation is so bad, if rising prices make life harder for most people, why does it exist at all? Why don't governments just keep prices stable? The answer is surprising, and it tells you a lot about how the modern economy actually works. A small amount of inflation, around 2% per year, is not just acceptable. It is deliberately targeted by most governments and central banks. It is, in fact, the goal. Why? Because the alternative, falling prices or deflation, is far more dangerous than most people realize. Imagine prices are falling. Everything gets cheaper over time. Sounds great, right? Actually, think about what happens to behavior. If you know that the car you want to buy will be cheaper next year, why buy it now? You wait. If businesses know their products will sell for less next year, they are reluctant to invest today. They wait. If everyone is waiting, consumers, businesses, investors, the economy slows down. Companies make less money. They lay off workers. Those workers spend less. Companies make even less money. The economy contracts. This is a deflationary spiral, and it is one of the most feared economic phenomena in history. Japan experienced something like this for nearly 2 decades, starting in the 1990s, a period economists simply call the lost decade, which, rather painfully, ended up being closer to 2 lost decades. So mild inflation, around 2%, keeps the economy moving. It gently encourages spending because people know prices will be slightly higher tomorrow. It makes debt easier to manage over time because you repay loans with money that is worth slightly less than when you borrowed it. And it gives central banks room to respond when the economy slows down. The key word is balance. A little inflation, well managed, is a feature of a healthy economy, not a bug. The problem comes when it gets out of control. Let me tell you about Germany in 1923. After the First World War, Germany was forced to pay enormous reparations to the Allied powers. To do so, the German government did something that seemed practical at the time. They printed money. Lots of it. At first it worked. They paid their debts. But the more money they printed, the less each note was worth. And then prices started rising. So they printed more money to keep up with the rising prices, which made prices rise faster, which required more printing. By November 1923, the rate of inflation in Germany was approximately 29,500% per month. People were paid twice a day, so they could rush out and spend their wages before prices rose again by the afternoon. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January cost 200 billion marks by November. When inflation reaches this kind of extreme, when a currency completely loses the trust of the people who use it, economists call it hyperinflation. And it is not just an economic event. It destroyed savings that people had spent lifetimes building. It wiped out the middle class. It created widespread poverty and social unrest. Historians widely agree that the economic devastation of the 1920s contributed directly to the political instability that followed, with consequences that changed the course of history. Inflation, when it loses control, is not just an economic problem. It is a social one. So, if governments know that high inflation is dangerous, and they absolutely do, how do they fight it? The short answer is, they make borrowing more expensive. The most powerful tool a central bank has is the interest rate, specifically, the rate at which it lends money to commercial banks. When a central bank raises this rate, borrowing becomes more expensive across the whole economy. Banks charge more on loans and mortgages. Businesses take out fewer loans. Consumers spend less. Demand falls. And when demand falls, the upward pressure on prices eases. Inflation slows. This is exactly what central banks around the world did aggressively in 2022 and 2023, as inflation surged following the pandemic. The U.S. Federal Reserve raised rates at one of the fastest paces in its history. The Bank of England did the same. The goal was to slow the economy down just enough to bring prices under control, without slowing it down so much that it tipped into recession. That balancing act is sometimes called a soft landing, and it is very, very difficult to get right. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The tools used to fight inflation have real costs. Higher interest rates mean higher mortgage payments for homeowners. They mean businesses invest less and hire fewer people. They mean the economy grows more slowly. Fighting inflation is necessary, but it is never painless. By this point, you understand what inflation is and where it comes from. But let's bring it right back to your life, because this is where it gets personal. Think about savings. If you have money sitting in a savings account earning 1% interest per year, but inflation is running at 4%, what is actually happening? On paper, your balance is going up. But in real life, your money is losing value. This is what economists mean by your real return. It is not just the interest rate your bank shows you, it is that number minus inflation. And if inflation is running higher than your interest rate, your real return is negative. You have more numbers on the page, but you can buy less with them. This is why simply saving money is not always enough. It is why people invest in stocks, property, bonds, in an attempt to grow their money faster than inflation erodes it. A positive number in your account does not automatically mean your wealth is growing. What matters is whether it is growing faster than prices. And here's something worth thinking about. Inflation does not affect everyone equally. People who own assets, houses, shares, businesses often see those assets rise in value during inflationary periods. Their wealth is, to some extent, protected. But people who depend on fixed incomes, retirees, for example, or workers whose wages don't keep pace with rising prices, can find that inflation silently cuts their standard of living year after year without a single dramatic event to point to. This is why inflation is not just an economic issue. It is a question of fairness. If you've been following Michael's Mindcast for a while, you'll know we like to zoom out. To ask, what does this all mean? Here's what I keep coming back to. Inflation is not an accident. It is not a glitch in the system. It is, in many ways, the result of the system, of decisions made by governments, central banks, businesses, and billions of individual consumers, all interacting in ways that no single person controls or fully understands. When you hear politicians blame inflation on the other party, or on corporations, or on foreign countries, be skeptical. The causes of inflation are almost always more complex than any one villain can explain. And the solutions are almost always more painful than any one policy can fix. What you can control is your own understanding. Because when you understand how inflation works, you start to see the economy differently. You understand why your central bank raises interest rates even when it hurts. You understand why your government is sometimes reluctant to spend, even when people need help. You understand what your savings are actually doing or not doing over time. Understanding inflation doesn't make you immune to it, but it does make you less vulnerable to misunderstanding it. Let's bring it back to where we started. That coffee shop. That moment when the price has gone up and your money doesn't quite cover it anymore. Inflation is in that moment, but now you know what's behind it. You know it might be because demand surged and purchasing power fell, or because supply chains broke down and costs were pushed up the line, or because wages and prices chased each other in a spiral, or because somewhere a government printed too much money, or a central bank waited too long to act. You know that a small amount of inflation is the intended destination of the modern economy, and that too much of it can unravel societies. You know that fighting it with interest rates has real costs, and that those costs are not shared equally. You know that your real return on savings matters more than the number on the screen, and that understanding the difference is what separates people who manage their money well from those who don't. Money, it turns out, is not just what's in your account. It is a system built on trust, shaped by decisions, and constantly changing. And inflation is one of the clearest windows into how that system actually works. That's the story of rising prices. And the more you understand it, the better equipped you are to navigate your own financial life. If you found this useful, share it with someone who's been confused about why everything seems to cost more lately. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is hand them a clear explanation. And if you want to keep building this kind of practical understanding of economics, money, and the systems that shape our world, you know where to find us. This is Michael's Mindcast. Think clearly. Stay curious. Until next time.